it this Monday.
This meeting is
We
being
released it
recorded.
last week, so we had some more time before today's meeting to go over it. It makes some changes, and I've got a presentation that I will share, and we'll walk through that. I'm sorry to be sort of being duplicative on this slide deck, but I think it's important for us to make sure that everybody has the same information. So let's see what we've got here. I hate doing PowerPoint slides when screen sharing because it doesn't work quite the way I think it should. All right, let's see if we can begin this. All right, that should just be a slide with one thing and you're not seeing all the notes and that kind of thing. So the final rule came out on the 6th. It becomes effective in April. However, you can apply the final rule immediately if you so choose. Anyone who uses the old interim final rule for making decisions before the April effective date is held harmless. So you can use either the new rule or the interim final rule until April. After April, the interim final rule becomes the rule, and all decisions made after the effective date have to be made in compliance with the new rule. The Treasury is not looking to bust folks' butts on this one, so I wouldn't worry too much about it. But just know that the effective date is April, except that you can use it now. So the big news and the things everybody's going to care about is what can you do with the ARPA funds now? What did the rule do to change the interim final rule? You will remember that there are 6 expenditure categories, 6 different buckets. These are those buckets: the public health bucket, the assistance to businesses and nonprofit organizations. There's also an element here that deals with building public capacity. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. Assistance to households or impacted communities. The premium pay bucket, the infrastructure bucket, and the general government services bucket, which is the one that is tied to the revenue replacement calculation. The big news is that the revenue calculation was changed. And in so doing, they've made this bucket much bigger for most of Rhode Island's municipalities. You'll remember that the general government services bucket is the bucket where you can do almost anything that a government does. Anything that a government does is a general government service, including these things that were listed in the interim final rule. The 2 big changes are these. There is a $10 million minimum election. Any municipality may say, we choose to, or we elect to assume $10 million worth of revenue loss for the entire period of the ARPA performance. So that means that if you have less than $10 million in ARPA funding coming to you, your election of the $10 million minimum means all of your money can be put into the general government services bucket. That's most of the small. In fact, it's going to be the vast majority of Rhode Island municipalities that are not entitlement communities. So that's a big change. You can put everything into general government services if you have less than $10 million worth of ARPA funds coming. The other major change is if you cannot fit all of your revenue loss into a $10 million cap, then you can still do the revenue calculation and you get to assume 5.2% rather than 4.1% as your presumed growth rate. We had been talking about this being, it's the actual loss plus the loss of what was anticipated growth. And they were using the national average of 4.1% as that anticipated growth. That number has been adjusted upward to 5.2%. So every municipality, even those that have to elect to do the calculation, have more money that can be put into the general government services to the extent that you've suffered a revenue loss bucket. This is the calculation. I'm not going to spend any time on it. Most folks don't have to worry about this anymore. The next category, the next bucket that you can spend out of is public health. These are the sorts of things that were listed and continue to be allowed under the final rule. The major change is that the final rule provided clarification and a long list of enumerated things that are specifically authorized. If you're going to put money into public health, if it's really genuinely public health, you're going to be fine. But you should look at the final rule and just make sure that it's on that long list. The long list is not exhaustive. So if it's of like kind and it isn't one of the 988 things that they have listed, it may still be eligible, but you should look at the list and you should just make sure that if it's there, you've documented that you looked and it's there. Assistance to businesses and nonprofit organizations. Again, this is what the interim final rule told us. Impacted industries were presumed to be hospitality, leisure, travel, or tourism. And then you could do an analysis locally to determine whether other industries were impacted. And the example I've used with the league quite often is the fishing industry in Galilee. While they are not hospitality, leisure, travel, or tourism, clearly the fishing fleet suffered because restaurants were not buying fish. And because they suffered, they were an impacted industry. So we could make the assertion that that industry should be treated just like hospitality, leisure, travel, or tourism. There was also a small business support and a hard hit communities. This was a QCT analysis that we've talked about many times. The final rule changed a couple of things here, and I'll go over those briefly, and we'll have opportunity to answer questions as well. It clarified the requirement that all grant recipients in the travel, tourism, and hospitality sector, though that presumption only goes to businesses that were operating prior to the pandemic. It's not a hotel startup that's trying to get going now. It's one that was operating before the pandemic. Aid to other impacted industries, we're going to have to show now either an 8% employment loss, which is what was suffered by the travel, tourism, and leisure industry, hospitality industry, or we've got to do an analysis to show that the impact, some impact, revenue loss, decline in market, some revenue, some loss, some impact was equal to the impact that the tourism industry suffered. Now, this is important if you've got a big employer, but the final rule also, and the commentary on the final rule also makes clear that all small businesses, that is businesses with fewer than 500 employees, are presumed to have been impacted. No analysis necessary. If it's under 500 employees, they are presumed to have been impacted. And you can provide much assistance in the assistance to business bucket just because they are a small business. Disproportionately impacted businesses are those within a QCT, and there's slightly more intervention that you're allowed to do here. You can do things like technical assistance that you might not be able to do for other small businesses, and grants for startups and expansions. Aid to nonprofits is the same set of rules. 500 or fewer employees, we're going to treat it like a small business. Public sector capacity. In the interim final rule, you could use the funds for payroll for a portion of the eligible public health and public safety staff that were dedicated to the COVID-19 response. The rule makes it a little more clear and also allows for us to hire above the pandemic baseline for those sectors, for the public sector, the entire public sector, I'm sorry. Assistance to households, again, the interim final rule told us this. You can do these things. And the final rule provided broader eligibility. Really, the only major change is it provided broader eligibility for students and assistance to students. Remember, we had the analysis about whether the community was disproportionately impacted. They've essentially said any student who was out of school was a disproportionately impacted community member. Premium pay, this was the rule under the interim final rule. Not much change here, but I will say that it confirms that an essential worker must be regular. Interactions with, must have, be regular, have regular interactions with this group of people, and also has to be in person. It's not remote workers. The final rule does provide a longer list of enumerated jobs than what had been provided in the interim final rule. And these restrictions still apply. The $13 an hour for all work may not exceed $25,000 per person, must be on site, in person, not more than 150% of the state average. Infrastructure, this is what the interim final rule told us about water and sewer projects. These rules are still intact. With regard to broadband, there was some change. Broadband projects now have to, I'm sorry, I'm going to jump to the change. Broadband projects now have to only have 120 versus 25 was the absolute minimum, and it was 100 upload download speeds. We're now at 100 download and 20 megabytes per second upload speeds will qualify a project for ARPA funding. The final rule also allows for cybersecurity investments as part of this expenditure. So that's what the rule did. And I'm going to stop sharing. We're happy to answer questions.
Actually, before that, I just want to highlight a couple of things. Rob did a great job trying to fly through all that about the different changes, but from the legal perspective, Rob, was absolutely right. It's a long document. The final rule is a long document. Some of it is redundant from the interim, but what they tried to do with the final rule was incorporate all the comments, the thousands plus of comments they received from all across the country, answer as much of the questions in a condensed fashion, but then let you know how it was enacted within the final rule. But one of the key things that you have to, even though it's broadened a lot of areas, the restrictions that were in the original ARPA Act, whether it's pensions, going into reserves, the restrictions that were expanded in the interim final rules, they all remain the same. And they've highlighted in so many different areas, especially in that general government services area, that they don't want to see you try to backdoor into these areas. So that's one of the things that you really have to be cautious about with those restrictions staying in place. The other key things that as you're going through, look, I can't stress enough, whether it's your solicitors, whether it's whoever you hired as compliance or anyone else, you have to read this rule because it is not easy. The key part about whether you're reading a federal rule or even reading an audit, it's the footnotes. And if you take a look at the footnotes, they'll show a lot of examples of what they like and don't like. For instance, on one of the expanded projects, one of the questions that came up was about, okay, transit-oriented developments. It'll make sure that there's, taking care of a lot of people in a certain area. Well, they frown upon that. So there are certain examples where they broadened it and a lot of eligible criteria that they listed. There are also some no-nos that they will disfavor, unless you can show your own examples of how it fits in that's reasonably proportionate to the bucket that you're trying to attack. So while it's a long list, be cautious of that. Take a look, as Rob also highlighted, there are a lot of presumptions out there. So don't be afraid to take advantage of those presumptions. But the last thing is, for compliance purposes, document everything. There was a great NLC webinar I was on yesterday that dealt with the auditing functions, because all of this is going to be part of the audit. So in that webinar, what they talked about was, yeah, Treasury is going to be sending out people to take a look at this. They might not look at every single community, but the one area that we'll be looking at is going to be part of your audit, and they're going to take a look at whether you follow the necessary purchasing procedures federally, whether you follow the restrictions, presumptions in the Act. So from a compliance standpoint, those are some of the keys from a legal and compliance that you're going to need to have the right resources and document everything.
Rob, this is Rich in Portsmouth. I've got a question. Hopefully you can clarify this.
Sure.
Obviously, it's easier for obviously most of us to do the $10 million lost revenue. That's just administratively, it's just so much easier.
Mhm.
But when you read that rule, you can use the $10 million for government services, general government services. So if you elect to do that $10 million option, are you limited to the general services, or can you use that money for the other buckets? For instance,
Yeah.
Infrastructure.
Yep. So I think the answer is yes, you can do with it whatever a government normally does. The one example I keep using over and over is general government services really does mean any service that government generally does. So the only place you get into a weird situation is where it's something that you haven't normally done and wouldn't normally do with your own money, right?
Well, a lot of what we're about to do is stuff we don't normally do.
But would it be something that you wouldn't do if you had the money yourself?
I understand.
So the example I use is, I keep picking on Narragansett, Galilee, and now a souvenir shop. But if the town of Narragansett decided to open up a beach souvenir shop, that's kind of known as a private sector space. It's not a public sector space. In some places, government runs enterprises like souvenir shops, but not so much here. That's where I'd start getting nervous. If it's, expanding any service that you already provide, if it's doing the sorts of things that you traditionally have done, even if it's something you haven't done in many years, then I think it's a general government service. You only get into a weird place when it's something that's, I would argue, competitive with the private sector.
Right. Now with that infrastructure, just a quick follow on. Let's say there's a water authority that is not a town of Portsmouth government function. We don't provide them any money, but there is infrastructure that needs to be done. I say that falls under the water, sewer, broadband category, and that we would be perfectly within our rights to put money into that infrastructure, even though it's not a town government function.
Yep. So the rule, the final rule and the interim rule allow for governments to transfer funding to other government entities.
Right.
So you can do that.
Thank you.
But Rich, be careful, because if you do that, depending on how you do that,
Yeah, that's right.
if you create a sub-recipient relationship, there's a whole block about how you do that and how you appropriately document that relationship. And it's what Rob and I had talked about in one of our prior presentations. Make sure that you do it in a way that, documents the relationship and also has you watching over that relationship as well, because ultimately you're going to be responsible for those dollars, not that subrecipient necessarily.
Right. That clarifies it. Thank you.
Yeah. So that brings up an important distinction that I'll talk about for just a second here. With regard to subrecipients, when you give money to another entity as a subrecipient, you retain all liability for their actions. They're acting as your agent on your behalf. When you give money to a beneficiary, your liability is shut off. You've given the money to someone you've deemed to be an appropriate recipient, and that's that. So when it comes to providing money to nonprofit organizations, particularly nonprofit organizations, there's a big difference between giving the nonprofit organization a grant because they suffer revenue loss, because they've lost staff, because COVID impacted the operation of the nonprofit organization, and giving a nonprofit organization funding so that they can run a program. Because if they're running a program on behalf of the municipality, they're a subrecipient. If you're simply giving them a gift because they need it, that's a beneficiary, and you don't have liability for their actions with regard to those funds. Now, that having been said, remember the interim rule and the final rule both require that any intervention, any gift of money, any expenditure of money has to be proportionate to the harm suffered by the nonprofit organization in that case, or suffered by the industry or suffered by the business. You can't give a business that had, $250,000 worth of revenue in 2019, a $2 million grant because they need it. That's not proportionate. Tim.
A quick question.
Tim, you're going to have to pull your phone closer to yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that. We've been able to confirm that I just reimbursed.
Tim, closer still. I'm sorry.
I hear you, Tim.
That's okay. I'll have 5 minutes. I'm in a car.
We'll be on here for a bit, I suspect.
I have a question. If we have general income loss, how does that affect the timing of the spending of the money?
Yeah.
I classify it as general income loss. Do I not have to meet the deadlines of 24 and 26?
So no, you do. You still have to comply with the 24 and 26 requirement. All monies have to be obligated by December of 2024, and all monies must have been expended by December of 2026. That's true even for money that's being put to general government services. This is part of that whole conversation we've had over the course of the last few months about the need to identify the purpose to which the general government service money is going to be put. You cannot simply take the general government service money and drop it into your general fund and leave it there undesignated. If you do that, you will not be able to demonstrate that it did not go into pensions, which is a prohibited use. You will not be able to demonstrate that it did not go into a lawsuit settlement, because that's a prohibited use and you have to demonstrate that it wasn't put to that purpose. And you will not be able to demonstrate that it wasn't put into a rainy day fund, and arguably an undesignated fund balance is a rainy day fund. So you've got to designate the funds. You've got to tell folks where the money's going to go.
So we're keeping it in a separate fund so that just for that tracking purposes. But when Rich was talking about sub-recipients, do they fall under the same guidelines so that if I give them the money, is that my date, or do they have to spend it by the 24 and 26?
That's a good question. And the answer is sub-recipients are treated like you. Beneficiaries are not. If you give the money to an NPO, a nonprofit organization, and it's done, you've given it to them to replace their lost revenue, and they don't spend it by 2026, it's irrelevant because they're a beneficiary, and the liability and the compliance ends at your having given it to a beneficiary. If, on the other hand, you're running a program through an NPO, you have to guarantee that they meet the 24 and 26 deadlines.
Rob, I have a couple of questions, if I can.
Mr. Mayor?
One is, I mean, it sounds like we could take some of this money if we wanted to build a community center and put some of that mone towards that, right? General government service for that.
Yes.
And second question I have for you is, the school department also got a good sizable amount of money. Our school department's gonna be looking at, applying to RIDE to get some funding for some improvements to some of our school buildings. How are their funds designated? Is it the same rules that apply to us apply to them? How's that work?
Completely different set of rules administered by a different federal and a different state agency. All of the RIDE money comes through the U.S. Department of Education and the Rhode Island Department of Education. The rules are different. And
to add to that, the team from the state, the School Building Association, School Building Authority, will be presenting to our group during our ARPA call next week to go over some of the regulations associated with school construction using ARPA funds and or ESSER $3. So we'll have a little bit more insight next week.
Thank you.
And Mayor, the other thing to watch out for, especially I see a lot of finance people on that, the fight will always be also on those ESSER dollars, whether or not and how it's counted as part of the school's budget, especially as they're coming to you for any increases in their budget and the calculation towards maintenance of effort. So that's one of the things that, you know, from a city town side, you're gonna have to watch out for, because I know that's always a constant battle, how federal funds that come down are allocated towards their budget. Just spotting an issue when you get into budgetary season for you guys.
Robert,
Yes,
there's two other revenue replacement changes that were made that communities may want to be aware of. I think now you can compare the base year to a fiscal year or not a calendar year when you calculate your loss of revenue. That's a one-time decision you can make.
okay.
And second, I believe you can include a city or town-run water department into your calculation. They
Yeah.
said you can include all utilities if it's managed by the community.
That's good, because that was sort of a weird place, and I didn't see that in the final, so that's good.
Yeah.
I'll go
I
back.
think
and-
it's, I believe it's in there. And
Okay.
then three, the report is still due on the same day, the 31st. So you got 2 weeks to do a lot of work.
If you can't take the election, and I didn't look at the list recently, but I think the election applies to almost everybody in Rhode Island who isn't a entitlement community. The entitlement communities are above the $10 million, but almost nobody else is.
Rob, when it comes to that report, we kind of have to lay out buckets of where we plan on putting it. It doesn't have to be definitive projects, right?
That's correct.
So is there a template for this report?
You know, I think the report, you have to put projects because it says you have to assign project numbers.
If you've got projects.
Yeah.
But only if you've identified them already, only if you've actually got them.
Okay.
Robert, in the case of Coventry, we have 4 separate fire districts. And when it comes to appropriating ARPA funds to the fire districts as a separate entity, can we treat them like a nonprofit where we just hand it over and we're done? Or are we responsible for the reporting of how they apply the funds?
It's going to be the same, well, a couple of things. You can treat it as a general government service and just manage the monies yourself. You know, that's a possibility. Just, you know, build it into a payment schedule and say, we're going to give you guys, you know, $500,000 every year for the next 4 years or whatever it is. You can deal with it as if they were a town department. You can also deal with it as a subrecipient. You can give them a lump sum and say, you've got until 2024, 2026 to obligate and then expend all of these funds. And you're going to have to do the reporting and you're going to have to tell us, you know, what's going on and all of the stuff that you're going to have to do as a local government can be pushed down to the subrecipient. Or if it's proportionate to the impact that they suffered, you could treat them as a beneficiary and simply give them the funds. I think that's right because of the status in Rhode Island, but it's worth checking with your legal counsel and making sure that they feel comfortable with that treatment.
Thank you.
All right, we got some chat questions here. What do we got? How do you make the election? You simply tell Treasury that that's what you're doing, that this community has elected the $10 million revenue loss amount. It does apply to the next question. Does the revenue loss change, the $10 million include county fund monies as well as your municipal allocation? And the answer is yes. From Treasury's perspective in Rhode Island, those two funds are the same. They've merged. They were only there for an administrative purpose. The distinction only matters because of the way that they had to be calculated. The monies once given to the municipality for local municipal contribution, the NEU sum and the county share sum, they are the same money. They are. There's no distinction between those monies as far as Treasury is concerned once you've received them. Have we been able to confirm that the full 40% ride reimbursement will be available for funds given to the school districts? I have not. I don't know if Jordan has heard from RIDE. Do we know?
So I just shared that if it's ARPA related funds, I believe the short answer is yes. The long answer is a little bit more detailed, but yes. The ESSER $3 are not reimbursable, is my understanding though. So I'll share exactly what I got, and then they'll dive more deeply into that when they present next week.
The next question is, can we simply state that the revenue recovery is being used to support police fire salaries? So you've got to document that you've done it. You can't simply attest that that's what you've done. You've got to document that that's how your budgeting was done. But yes, so long as you identify where the money went and document that that's what happened with the money, you can certainly use it for police salaries.
Does it need to be documented in our budget documents, or can we document it when we process? So in Providence, right, we have $19.5 million in fiscal 22 that we're using as revenue replacement dollars. We haven't at this point identified what those $19.5 million are being used toward. With that said, I can very easily find $19.5 million worth of general government dollars that we're using it for. But can I do that when I go to like journalize the money out of our special revenue fund, or would I have to do some sort of like legal ordinance or something that spells it out?
So I guess part of the answer is it depends on who is legally authorized to make decisions about the funding, right? You've got to follow your local ordinances with regard to the expenditure of funds. If you normally allow people to just take grant funds from any source and put them hither and thither, then, and that's allowed, if that's what the local rule allows, I suppose you could do that. I suspect that your local expenditure rules require some sort of involvement by the mayor and or the council. You've got to follow your local rules. You can't just, this isn't money that, it's not dark money. It's money that has to be pursued or treated in the same way that you treat all money. It has to be tracked in the same way that you treat all public funds. Using
yeah, so I guess from so I have it on both sides, right? I have legal approval to take $19.5 million of ARPA money and transfer it to our general fund for revenue recovery. And then I have that revenue, in theory, because I have a balanced budget, that $19.5 million has been spent on general government services. So I guess what I'm trying to figure out is where I need to legally prove that $19.5 million was appropriated and what it was appropriated to, because we don't typically tie revenues directly to an expense in our budget process.
I do think that this is a question for your corporation counsel or for your solicitor. What I would suggest as part of your conversation is that you talk about the nature of that authority. The federal government isn't going to be looking for you to simply have had a transfer into the general fund. They're going to be looking for where that money went. And it's a stronger declaration of where that money went if it follows a specific designation. So I'd feel more comfortable personally if I had an authorization that said, put 19 of the ARPA toward police salaries.
Got it. Okay.
And Chrissy, yesterday on that NLC webinar, and I don't know if they're going to put it up or not, but for the finance people there, because the question you're asking is definitely a legal question, but it also jumps into that auditing function too, because the auditors, when they're looking at that single audit, are going to be checking to see how you guys document it. And that, that's going to be annual, and Treasury comes in, they just want to see wherever those allocations are. So definitely, Rob's right, follow your local rules. That's why the solicitor is important, but it's also an auditing function, how you would normally account for these dollars. if you want to go that extra step, you know, in finance to say it is part, we're going to dump it into, say, public safety, police and fire salary, that extra step just further protects you guys, you know, if Treasury comes down or if you're talking with your auditors at the end of the year.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you very much.
Just generally, the better and more detailed documentation is, the better off you're going to be in an audit. The next question in the chat, and we'll wrap the chat questions up, is there a reporting template that we should be using? And the answer is yes, it's available at the portal that everybody should be getting familiar with at this point. We'll make sure that we send out the link to the Treasury portal after this meeting. All right, I got Mr. Rossi first and then Mr. Wood. Mr. Rossi.
Thank you, Rob. Two quick things. One being, I know about us electing the standard deduction, so to say, on the revenue loss. Is that just when we report our first report and stating that, or is there something we have to fill out ahead of time?
I don't know the answer to the question. We've not really ever gotten a good answer on this question. Treasury, when they did the interim final rule back in May of last year, said, hey, you can do your 1920 number for us. Nobody has. So, I mean, you know, they're encouraging people to get into the portal and provide information as it becomes available. Beyond that, I don't think you're looking at any penalty or problem if you wait until you file your first report.
Perfect. And then the second question is if anybody's running any grant programs, you know, for the small businesses and things like that, that have a process laid out and maybe an application, if they can share it with the group or have anything to share to us, how it's going so far. Oh, perfect. I heard
we have one in Providence.
No, I know you guys do. I didn't want to call you out.
Oh, no, that's okay. Randy, let me reach out to our policy team because they've kind of built the application. We've been working with iParametrics, who's been doing, I think they did like a Google Doc application, and we're going to actually be trying to move all of our grant applications onto what was called Viewpoint Cloud. I don't know if any of you guys are using it for your building permits. It's now OpenGov. And they have a really great ARPA tool that we're working with them to kind of hijack the building permit process and turn it into an application process for various grants. So let me get all of our data together and I'll ship it over to you guys. But basically what we've done is iParametrics gives us a spreadsheet once a week of all of the approved businesses, and then we upload that into our ERP system and do a special check run for all of our small business grants.
Awesome. So are they doing the analysis of whether or not they're being approved? Okay.
Yep. They're doing all of that work for us. Yeah.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay.
And then they're giving us a file by recipient at the end of the day so that I can pull up and say, you know, Sally's barbershop got $2,500. Here's their all of their tax forms. Here's all of their tax returns. All the data we need is sorted by recipient.
Perfect. Thanks so much.
Yeah, I'll comment briefly on that exchange because I think it is important for folks to know. I think the final rule does make things a little simpler, but it certainly does not eliminate all of the compliance issues around making sure that you're managing a federal grant in accordance with the uniform guidance for the management of federal grants. You still have to comply with the federal regulations that underlie all grants. So there's still quite a bit of work to be done there.
Actually, and that's what, you know, to piggyback off Rob, you know, Crystal brought up iParametrics. For those of you that have never administered any federal funds before, and remember, this is different because you guys are the ones now administering it. It's not like here's where you're getting reimbursed for, you know, past actions. Definitely get outside help, whether it's iParametrics. I think there's you guys have two, iParametrics and someone else that's out there that has been responding to most of the RFPs. Get the outside legal help. But most importantly, Rob hit the nail on the head. It's not just ARPA. There's a host of other federal regulations you have to follow as to what's allowed and what's not that you might not be aware of. The uniform guidance is the Bible about, you know, procurement, about, you know, what's an allowable cost or not. So please be careful and just document every step that you take and get the help, because the help is an administrative cost. But even when you go out, you have to follow those federal procurement rules.
So I'm just going to follow up one more time on this. The state of Rhode Island's official position on whether you need to hire an outside consultant or anything like that is, no, you can do whatever you think is appropriate in your circumstances, but you should be planning for the administration. And Alan's exactly right. You have 10% of your entire grant allotment that is available for administrative expenses. If that means hiring people in town hall as town employees, you can do that. If that means hiring an outside consultant, outside lawyers, you can do that. If that means paying your solicitor more money so that they can do more research for you, that's allowed. You've got 10% of your total grant allotment that's available for administration of the grant by whatever means you deem most appropriate.
Rob, I think you misspoke. Mike Marcello, my solicitor, happens to be on this call. I don't think there's any extra money for solicitors. I just wanted to, all right.
Hey, Mayor, there's extra money for outside.
Hey, I heard. Hey, I heard him next door yelling and screaming, "Yippee, yippee!" I take it easy.
Mr. Wood, how are you?
I'm good, thanks, Rob. How you doing? So I think Alan sort of answered one of my questions. I do have two of them, but if you do an infrastructure project, you have to follow the federal bidding processes that relate to construction projects. And that I'm assuming includes water and sewer. And then is that spin off to broadband projects? Do you know offhand?
So actually, it's a little bit different. And it gets this gets us back into that subrecipient problem. You should check with your own legal counsel. I'm gonna preface everything by saying that, because I'm not giving you legal advice here. However, what the uniform guidance requires with procurement is that governments follow their own rules. You do everything that you would do if these were your monies. Nonprofit organizations or contractors who work for you may have to, depending on the relationship, follow the federal procurement rules.
Okay, I think that's, we can follow up with everybody if we need to. The second question is, we do have the separate fire departments here in our town as well. If we were to work with them collaboratively on a project, a procurement project, would we be able to give them a donation towards the project and let them fund the other part of it like that? What kind of relationship would we have to have?
So when doing general government services, and if you're able to characterize what you're contemplating as a service that governments normally provide, I don't think it matters that it's not a service that town hall normally provides. It's a service that governments normally provide. So I think you may, want to focus on whether you want to just do this as your project under general government services. If you want to transfer funds to the fire district or districts so that they can administer a program, you're going to either have to have the program set up as a contract or as a subrecipient relationship. If you want to just give them the money and hope they do the right thing with it, you can do that. But if you're going to do that, they are a beneficiary, and what you're doing has to be proportionate to the harm that they suffered, the revenue loss, the decline in staffing, whatever it is. You have to do an analysis to show that what you are doing is proportionate to the impact that they suffered because of COVID-19. Now I'm going to back up. That's a clear and I think true assertion about the way that plays out. But you should note that everything you do has to be proportionate to an impact that was suffered by COVID-19.
Thank you. I think you answered that beforehand. I wasn't sure it applied to the fire departments. Appreciate it.
Steve Coleman.
Hey, Rob. Just had a quick question because we were talking about fire districts. So you had mentioned that if any funds were to be given to a fire district, that it would have to be proportionate to the amount of the impact.
If the funds are being given to them as a beneficiary.
Okay, so if they're a beneficiary, it's to the impact. If it's a subrecipient, that would be different, right? Then it could fill in like backfilling salaries or whatever it may be.
Or if it's a joint governmental enterprise, then, it can be, it still has to be proportionate. You can't, I don't know. Alan, any thoughts on that? Because that's a funny situation.
That is if you're talking about fire district, it's a little quirky, Steve. The best way to do it is, an easiest way to document it would be through government services line item.
Yeah.
If you have a relationship with these fire districts, subrecipient relationships, have a lot more complexity to it. And you really have to make sure that that fire district, if you're entering into a subrecipient relationship, still follows the ARPA kind of general intent of where those dollars are supposed to go. So if they're doing it as a subrecipient relationship, and say, for instance, they want to give premium pay to, a lot of the personnel because they were there, they can do that, but it's still the documentation and everything else to make sure that everything is appropriate fits. However, when Rob's talking about it's something beyond, so if you're going to give and establish subrecipient relationship for the fire districts to work with the schools on something, you're going to have to make sure that it's a close connection, because that's not something that they're going to be administering something with the school, the school department normally, that I would say. So it's got to fit within OPCA. It's a difficult question to kind of answer off the cuff like this.
Yeah,
but it all depends on how that relationship is established.
Steve, I think, again, this is more detail or more complicated than we're going to be able to fully answer here. But I think a way to think about the relationship between a municipality and independent fire districts is that you can step in and provide a direct general government service. And that's an expenditure that's appropriate. You've got to do the documentation. You've got to make sure you're compliant with all the federal regulations as the municipality, because you're owning the project. If you want to pass some of that, administrative burden off to a fire district, you can, but I think you probably need a subrecipient relationship to do that, or a contract to do that. And at that point, you still own the responsibility for compliance, but they're doing the compliance work. The third possibility is to just give them money and say, you're a recipient. I think you can do that. That's a thing that we really do need to run to ground, but I think you can do that. The limit is going to be as if they were a nonprofit at that point. It's going to be the impact that you're responding to was, they lost $500,000 revenue for 2 years. We're giving them $1 million kind of thing. If you're trying to do more, you're trying to build something for the future. You're trying to not just respond to the immediate impacts of COVID-19. I don't think that method works. I don't think so. I don't know. It's a tricky question.
Gotcha. And I think you explained it pretty well. I think you got the 3 options, and it's just a matter of researching them to see if there's any that apply for any municipality that has a fire district or fire districts that are interested in taking part in this funding. So thank you very much.
But I do want to make it perfectly clear. There is definitely a way for municipalities to assist fire districts. Absolutely, positively a way for you to do that if you want to do it. All right, we got another in the chat. Has there been any clarification on the 10% indirect cost? I don't recall having seen anything in the final rule. I'll go back and look. I don't remember anything.
Sorry, Rob, I'm not sure I understood the question. The 10% on the administrative cost? Any clarification on that, or I'm not sure what they meant by the indirect cost.
Hi, Chris Bagnoli from Narragansett.
Okay.
Hi, in the interim final rule, I had read something about using the 10% de minimis indirect cost on the grant, on the federal funds. So I just wanted to know if that was still applicable or what exactly that meant. Would it be, 10% admin total, excuse me, and of that, you could split it up indirect or direct. Suppose we don't have 10% admin for whatever reason. Could we use the rest of it towards an indirect cost rate? That was my question.
Yeah, I'm not remembering anything from this 437 page document. But let me go back and have a look.
Yeah, and sorry, Chris, I can't recall off the top of my head on that either.
Yeah, it's just, more liquid money, so that's fine.
Right.
Well, be careful about that, because remember, the documentation part is critical. So even though you have 10% to be utilized to administrative, you've got to document the administrative and then you follow the rule to get the individual. It's not like, oh, I only spent 6%, so I have 4% of money that I can utilize for anything. It's got to be tied into,
No, the indirect, so it would go towards, finance salaries or something to that effect,
So long as you're apportioning that category towards ARPA.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think the answer, Chris, is going to end up being in the uniform guidance, not in the ARPA final rule.
Right.
Okay.
And I can't remember the rule off the top of my head.
It was just something I was looking into, but that it might not even come to fruition. So that's fine.
Okay.
But I would look at the uniform guidance, Chris. I'll look, but you should look as well. I think that's where we're going to find the answer.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
All right. All in all, pretty good news, I'd say.
Definitely agree, and I'm glad we waited. Most of us waited to start spending it because that flexibility is going to make our lives a lot easier.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, if you spent the time doing your revenue loss calculation, I'm sorry.
It was worth it in the end. Let's put it that way.
But for anyone else, remember that has spent, you're held harmless under the old rule, and you're still held harmless up until April 1. So that's the flexibility that you have.
Right. And for, the entitlement communities, you get to go back. So you did your Providence, for example, did their 19 point whatever it was based on a 4.1% national growth rate. It is now 5.2%. You've got an extra percent and a bit, 1.1% additional flexibility if you want to take advantage of it.
Well, good news.
Yeah. And Steve Coleman's got an announcement he'd like to make.
Yeah, well, this is actually like a joint between us and CRO. But one thing that the municipalities have been asking for is, some way to act as a clearinghouse for some of the expenditure categories that you guys are spending this money on, just to see what other people are doing. So us and PRO, what we came up with is we're going to add an extra tab to the budget to actual. You can participate if you want. You don't have to. Any information that you include there, we're going to include broad categories, and then we're going to be able to post that data so you guys can take a look at what people are spending money on for that particular year. Hopefully that helps out some of you in deciding what you're going to do with some of this money, and you can reach out to whoever, the data shows is actually spending on whatever category it may be. So we're going to get that format out by the end of this week, hopefully. We're just working on what the broad categories will be because we don't want to add too much to what's already there, maybe like 5 to 10 categories or something like that. But if you guys have any input, let us know.
Steve's my hero on this one. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, that was exciting news. I think people love extra transparency, so this is awesome. On behalf of the league, thanks everybody for being here. Just a quick reminder again that we did postpone our annual convention from January 27th to August. Oh my goodness, I'm jumping too far ahead. April 28th. of this year, same time, same place. So we'll see you then. Also next week, as I mentioned earlier, we are still having our regular ARPA call that will resume our bi-weekly meetings. And we will be joined by folks from the School Building Authority to talk a little bit more about school funding categories. So I hope to have you join us then. And again, obviously, Rob and Mayor Fung are usually available to us, and we'll be able to have them answer any additional questions that you come up with. Before we go, I did just want to ask, I know that we have our municipal leaders COVID call later today with the governor's team, but Richard, did you have anything else you wanted to add ahead of that?
Thanks, Jordan. No, just a reminder to all of our municipal leaders, 1:30 today, we should have some more information for you in regards to getting those test kits out. So we'll have plenty of information for you at 1:30. So if you're available, please join us.
Thank you, Richard. All right, if there's nothing else, I feel like we've had a really good day today. I thank you for your time, and we'll talk to you all soon.
Take
Yeah.
care.